Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 385, April the 20th, 1979, and this is side one of this tape. Tape number 385, this tape, and probably 386 next week, will be a two-part cassette, as I do sometimes when I run a series, because I don't know if I'll be able to cover in 1 hour the amount of material that I want to get in on this tape today. So this will be the first of a two-part tape, because I'm going to deal extensively with a subject, two subjects, that I've been following for a while. One, the John Kennedy assassination, which I've been studying for 15 years, and the other is Jonestown. And I want to talk about the common denominators, some stories that may be possible to link together the cause and the meaning of Jonestown and how it relates to the John Kennedy assassination. That's a big job, but pieces of the puzzle are coming together, and I want to go over it very slowly with you and see if we can grasp the interconnecting links and make some sense of these phenomena. Before I do that, I want to mention that not next week, but the week after, May 4th, 5th, and 6th, up at Davis, University of California campus at Davis, it's just about 20 miles from Sacramento, there's going to be their 10th annual Festival of Mind, Body, and Spirit, they call it. It's an ecological affair that they have. It's the 10th year. I attended one of these similar 2 years ago at Cal State in Sacramento. But this is at Davis, and they've invited me to speak there and to be included among the various persons. It's a group of people interested in art and in health and ecology and spirituality and human potential and in the environment. And it's a very energizing, it's a good experience to be among these young people and some older ones too, who are into preserving things that we have on planet Earth, taking care of the quality of life and taking greater responsibility in their own hands for their own health and their minds. I'll be speaking there at the main auditorium at around 7 in the evening. And then there'll be a research group, a seminar, an hour later. I think I'm going up for the whole 3 days to mingle and be with the people and hear the other speakers, and they'll have musicians and bands and so forth. And if any of you in the Bay Area who take the tapes want to meet me there, you can phone me or write, better just phone, and I'll get more information about where we could meet. There will be a discussion group afterwards, so you could meet me Saturday afternoon somewhere around 5 or 6 o'clock, and as I say, I'll be speaking Saturday evening from around 7 to 8, I think, that's the schedule, and or 6 to 7. It isn't firmly set, but I will be there at the main auditorium, a lecture forum, and then agreed to have a seminar for people who want questions later. So that'll be a more personal thing, and many of you may want to meet and get together, and it's a really good festival, and we can have a lot of fun, and it's a place to answer your questions if you have a lot of them, and to get a nice weekend out of it if you want it. And it'll be early enough if you have to get back to San Francisco or to other cities on the peninsula or up north. There are many people who do take these tapes who have been wanting to meet, and I never have enough time when I get in that direction. So if you want to do it, this is a place where we could be. It'll be at Davis, and I'll be up there the whole weekend, but specifically Saturday afternoon and the evening, the early evening. The subject that they want me to talk about, the theme that they have for the 3-day conference, is called Tools of Transformation. And of course, with my research, in the area that I'm particularly interested in is the moral and ethical purposes for which to make life better. If you don't have that reason, if you don't have that philosophy, then all the research in the world doesn't make any difference. So I'll be going into areas such as affection and attentiveness, or principles, loyalty, life purposes, and kindness, and courtesy, and gratitude, and humility, and honesty, and individuality, and justice, and even refinement and patriotism. There's a lot of tools to make life better, and they apply to researchers. Many of the researchers don't have those tools, unfortunately. They're pretty blunt, and I think that's one reason they don't get as far as they should with the amount of information they have, and some of them are pretty nice, and some are very, very nice. But there has to be a certain self-control, a self-direction, a respect for the law, a thoroughness, and a trust, even with all the things that are going on, and a sense of duty. And I will talk about some of these things that I think are important as we search for assassins and conspirators and people that continuously murder and pillage individuals and the planet Earth. We also have to have a sense of orderliness and tidiness and respect for people. And I think the work will become monumental and effective if we combine these tools that we have. And of course I'll be going into the tools that they want to talk about of transformation, which I believe are value systems, then education, more formal education, the use of communication, language, radio and newspapers, and tape cassettes, of course. The tools of transformation, I believe, are individual, refining your own individual traits while you refine the world, and combining them, combining your information and your lifestyle, so that you build a very solid rock that is a foundation for other people to emulate and to observe and to see that it works, that you can be very calm and idealistic and practical and realize your sense of duty and your culture and develop friendships and have a strong foundation, which I have tried to do, and this is what I'll be going into at Davis. And for those of you who can't attend, in a gist, that's how I feel about the research, the tools of transformation to make changes in this world, if they are possible, come through a combination of value systems plus a lot of hard work that is motivated by those value systems, and using your books, radio, television, tape cassettes, your fountain pen, your eyes, your ears, whatever you've got, to pass along the information and give it to the next generation to use, and hopefully it will be solid enough that they'll learn to live by it. Two adopted sons of Jim Jones, one is 20 years old, Timothy Glenn, and the other is 18 years old, Jim Jones Jr., he's 18, have asked for immunity before the federal grand jury on an investigation in San Francisco about the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan. And Judge Robert Peckham was told that the Joneses had refused to answer questions before the grand jury. The assistant U.S. attorney, his name is Donald Ayer, asked that they be ordered to answer these questions, and then he said that the investigation may take twists and turns which we may not have foreseen. He replied, there is nothing to contradict the claims of innocence of these men, but the U.S. attorney, Ayer, went on to say that the investigation will be going for 2 months into Ryan's killing, but that it is not to say the focus may change in the future. How far the San Francisco courts will go into the investigation of Jonestown is an open question. I don't believe that they can go very far, because the whole San Francisco political structure and the federal government is involved in Jonestown. There's a cemetery in Marin County that was to receive some of the bodies. There's 547 that are still not buried after 5 months, and that cemetery was desecrated this week with spray cans and signs that Jonestown doesn't belong here. 366 of the 913 have been buried. 234 are still not identified. Of the 234 not identified, 199 are children. 35 adults are unidentified, even though there were passports at Jonestown for each person, and by the process of elimination, if you take 913 and you can identify a great number, 366 have been buried by relatives. It seems to me that when you get down to that number and you have passports for each person, that they could be identified by the passports. But of course we were told that the names were changed and that some of the people weren't the same as on the passports. There was one news comment that the people's names might not match the passports, which is still one of the open questions. And before I get into the subject of Jonestown and the Kennedy assassination, I must remind you and review again that the various survivors said that there were 1,200 members or 1,100 members, depending on which lawyer or which persons are speaking, but the figure is never less than that. And there were 913 slain. So taking the lowest number, 1,100 members, that would mean 187 left from that, which is 80 survivors that are still around and 107 missing. And it's at 107 that are missing with the question mark that I want to keep open in pertaining to the subject I'm going to be talking about on the tapes this week and next week. As I say, there's 234 unidentified, and 199 were children. So that actually that makes over 330 that were not identified, because 107 are missing and the 234 are unidentified. So there's no way of knowing who was buried and who was shot or poisoned and who got away. Oh, one other point in the news before I get into Jonestown. The last thing I do want to bring up, and there was a lot of news I did want to get into this week. Most of you, I'm sure, saw the article in Thursday's paper that the FBI is not going to investigate the murder of CIA officer John Paisley, that the Senate Intelligence Committee in Congress wanted them to go into the mysterious circumstances of Paisley's death, and the FBI decided that they wouldn't go into it, whether he was a Soviet agent for the KGB or whether it was a suicide, whether he was the victim of KGB assassin or a suicide, or whether or not it was John Paisley. Doesn't seem to interest the FBI. Now that's interesting with their notorious anti-communist stance all these years, that they would be so casual about John Paisley. For those of you who don't have the tapes that I did on Paisley, you can order those back tapes, or you can write to Penn Jones Jr. and get the article I did on John Paisley for his continuing inquiry. The article in the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday referred to John Paisley's working with the CIA in 1974, being called back in 76 as a coordinator of their A team and their B team. And it's those words that I think that are interesting in lieu of the article that I want to go into with you at length now and for the remainder of this tape. The Counter Spy magazine issued an article in December 1978 of this year that it was put together before, keep in mind, before Jonestown. Jonestown took place the end of November 19th, up through the entire weeks of November and December. The Jonestown story was breaking. And these magazines usually date ahead, or certainly it takes months ahead of writing, 3 months ahead. So that the article that was written by Conrad Ege, E-G-E, for Counter Spy, and I'm giving you the address for you to order it and own it, was printed just at the time that prior to the story when Leo Ryan was coming down to Jonestown and before the Jonestown death of 913 people. Now this story is about a place in Chile called Colonia Dignidad. I'm giving you the address and the spelling of the tape. And I'm going to jump around with the article because in my usual style, I read the article. It's a 7 or 8 page story for Counter Spy, and I retyped it into about 20 or 30 pages and outlined it every point. And I want to go down the line with you on this story because even though it was only 8 pages and it's about a religious Christian cult in Chile, as I went through the article and had to retype it, I noticed 67 parallels to Jonestown in a 7 or 8 page article. 67 parallels to Jonestown, and I see the overlink and the overlaying layers of this German cult to what was going on in Jonestown. Now, the name of the cult in Chile is called Colonia Dignidad. It is a place, an orphanage. It is a place where children were brought, a Christian sect, from Germany to Chile, similar to the Christian sect that was brought from San Francisco and Redwood Valley down to Guyana. And the time levels overlay pretty close to the arrangements of the German movement and the California Guyana movement. The camp is an isolated place like Jonestown, and the author of this article made some comments about it. The Colonial Dignidad is a sequence of fascism, of good Nazi fascism that moved from Germany to Chile. And of course, I believe that Jonestown is a fascism that moved from Germany to the United States to Guyana. The author asked that the Western world don't separate themselves from the torture that goes there and the repressions going on in Chile, because America, the United States Army, specifically made it possible for the military junta in Chile to come to power, to put the Nazis into power, and as soon as they were in, they were displaying their swastikas on the streets of Chile. Henry Kissinger and ITT and Volkswagen and Kennecott Copper, and of course Kissinger being the spokesman for the Nelson Rockefeller Chase Manhattan Council of Foreign Relations gang. This author blames the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. banks, and European money for making this fascism possible. And he asked the question, where is democracy, or what is democracy? And the question he asked in this article is what I've asked for many, many years, ever since I began my work on the John Kennedy assassination and saw that Lee Harvey Oswald's closest friends, 20 or 30 of them, were part of the Nazi Galen operation, and his closest friend was a Nazi spy during World War II and had been groomed by the Nazis, a czarist, George Morgenthau. The author asks in this article on Colonial Dignidad, what is the United States doing, or what is West Germany doing? Do we use a front by calling ourselves democracies, which simply consists of making profits from fascism all around the world? Now, we've done this in South Korea, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, South Africa. What we call democracy here is an exchange of repressions and fascisms everywhere. In other words, our financial success borders on the fact that we have the illusion of democracy on the surface while we're putting fascism and military juntas into power all over the world. And the question is asked in the article, well, how long will Western corporations and bankers profit? Is profit always the primary motivation force in a democratic structure? Is democracy what we should be working for, or is totalitarianism really the maximum profits, and the front of the elections is the cover for the democracy? The author, Conrad Eeg, is asking the questions that I've wanted to ask and have asked over and over again ever since World War II was over. How we put the Nazis in power in Greece, how we overthrew 77 countries and put in military dictatorships, calling ourselves a democracy, ruling out people like Andreas Papandreou in Greece, who obviously isn't a communist, admitting, just recently there were articles, a long article in the Los Angeles Times, admitting that Mossadegh was not a communist, that he was not a threat in Iran when the CIA overthrew that government and put in the Shah, that it was the oil they wanted, simply the oil in Iran, and that was the excuse for the Savak, for the tortures. The profit system was the motivation, not that Russia would take over Iran, or that even later that Mao Zedong or Chu Enlai or these various persons that we accused of being strong communists. They weren't communists. It was the profits for the drugs, for the oil, for making war. And there's a long exposure, as I said just recently, on Mossadegh, his politics, and we know also in Greece that the motivating factor in turning fascism is just pure profit for a few corporations and keep the rest of the people literally slaves and not killing them off. Now, before I go into the 67 comparisons to this operation down there in Chile called the Colonial Dignidad, I like to start at the end. I'd like to tell you the conclusions of the article and then go back to the beginning. I do this when I read a book or even when I see a movie. I like to know the end, the punchline, and then see how it reconstructs. I just happen to be that way. So I'm going to blow the finale of this article for you and then start at the beginning with you. The finale is that the repressions that were taking place in this colony, and remember when Jim Jones says, die with dignity, dignidad, Colonia Dignidad. This was an orphanage started by Christians, sent by the West German government to Chile, where the Nazis had settled after World War II, and the cover was an orphanage, and they separated children from their parents, and they only spoke German there. They didn't teach them the Spanish language, and they had an agricultural farm and a cattle farm, self-sustaining agricultural area, which was perfect for nurturing and hiding fascism. But the front for this farm was actually the headquarters for the Fourth Reich and the Nazi Germans that used the farm. And along the farm, underneath the ground, away from the children and the orphanage and the agricultural commune, were places and passageways where people from DINA, which is D-I-N-A, which is the Chilean police, put in by the CIA, like the SAVAK was put in by the CIA in Iran. The Chilean police use it for torture and interrogations, and they take persons, and many of them have died, a few have escaped. They talked about the tortures, and they were taken to this colony, and the people living there at the colony can't hear them. They're taken first with hoods over their face with grease underneath the hoods, chemicals that stick to their face, and wet towels in their mouth. And then they strap them naked to beds and use electrodes and tortures and have dogs sexually assaulting them and chewing out their genitals, eating and chewing their genitals and maiming them and hanging them and choking them and tape recording their tortures, and many died, some escaped. It's on the grounds of the Nazi headquarters, and when Amnesty International began to investigate and write articles about this great colony, the German press suppressed it, like they're doing the Jonestown stories. The German courts suppressed it. They didn't deny the charges, but they suppressed it. And the author says that the reason it was suppressed in Germany, and the reason the United Nations ignored the complaints about what was going on at Colonia Dignidad, was because it was much larger than on the surface. It wasn't just a place like the Shah of Iran's torture center, the House of the Savak. It's linked to South Africa and West Germany, and the CIA, the common denominator of all this is South Africa and West Germany and the Central Intelligence Agency, because the CIA put in the West German government with Reinhard Gehlen and Hitler's agents, and the CIA put in Pinochet and the Chilean government, and they also approve and finance and work with the South African racism and Nazis, and have a triangle of weapon supplies and money and funding going between these three headquarters of South Africa, West Germany, and Chile, and also the role of the United States. The West German government has supported Colonial Dignidad. The West German government would not antagonize the Chile junta that was put in by the CIA. And as I say, these large corporations have been behind the flow of profits to themselves that kept slave labor and keep slave labor going. And that's why the torture, to keep the labor movements and the oppressed from organizing, they are killing and torturing all those people that speak up in order to keep the life expectancy down, the wages down. Comparison 66, starting backwards and then going forward, was that the United States wanted bauxite and the minerals from Guyana and wants to develop Guyana. It isn't a socialist country. It was put in by the Central Intelligence Agency too. Another comparison between Jonestown and Guyana and Chile was that the CIA put in both governments and overthrew the existing electoral system and chose the people that they want to run it. The CIA put in the Guyanese government and the premier there, and also wants the bauxite and the minerals, the Mellon family and Mellon interests, and many of the United States financiers have interest in Guyana, as well as the CIA station in Matthews Ridge that was very much a part of this whole operation. The author of this article says Colonia Dignidad is a link to a complex network. The West German ambassador to Chile, his name is Erich Straitling, I'll give you his name and spelling on the sheet that's enclosed here, was formerly the West German ambassador to South Africa. He was sent from South Africa to Chile to strengthen the links of West Germany and South Africa and Chile. As I say, there's this triangle. Now, they work closely with SATO, South Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a sister of NATO, and that recently was exposed as having one of its leaders a former Nazi. And one of Henry Kissinger's plans, one of his original plans, was to form SATO, South Atlantic Treaty Organization, to, in quotes, stem the tide of destabilization in South Africa and in Latin America. Now, I've said all along that Henry Kissinger was not and never has been Jewish, that he was a Nazi plant and took on the cover of being Jewish, of his family being Jewish, and that he's worked with Nazis from Germany and Rockefeller and Trilateral, the Bilderbergers, and Prince Bernhard, and the world's worst Nazis. And it was Henry Kissinger, handpicked by Standard Oil when he came to this country and plunked to Harvard, and he was in military intelligence and sent back to Germany. Kissinger, at the time of Watergate, you remember, worked with ITT and Richard Nixon and helped overthrow Allende and set up the coup there, set up Politico, the game plans for overthrowing Chile. Henry Kissinger set up SATO, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the links of South Africa down to Chile. Chile gets 40% of its arms from South Africa. Bonn, Germany, sends them to Africa. They can send them to Africa, and Africa sends them to Chile. There's a love affair between West Germany, the United States, South Africa, and Chile. And these links, as I say, were set up by Henry Kissinger. Now, a parallel to Jonestown, the Henry Kissinger connections to Rockefeller are important, because if Chile and Argentina are next to each other, and this farm, this work farm, this torture center, Colonia Dignidad, borders right next to Argentina, so that A, no one can escape. If they run over, they'll be returned by the Argentine Nazi police, or B, if somebody comes to Colonia Dignidad and catches on, they can flee to Argentina and hide. And that's what happened with the Venezuela property when Jonestown was rented in Guyana. The conditions were at Matthews Ridge, where they went to see the property, and Jim Jones was there in '63 and knew the terrain and would be returning later in '73. The conditions were that they could walk to Venezuela to escape, and it also be that they could go to Venezuela and hide if somebody came, as they did to Jonestown. The boats are missing. Jim Jones' boats are missing. The people that set up Jonestown are missing. Venezuela banks had Jim Jones money in them, and that's been hushed up since the exposure of the $26 million that was left in these international banks. Rockefeller's oil, the Panapec oil, comes from Venezuela. Nelson Rockefeller, the man who moved Henry Kissinger around as his puppet, has a large farm in Venezuela that borders to this setup, identical. The Venezuela connections to Jonestown and Guyana are identical to the Chile connections to Argentina, where you have repressive centers for experimentation on people, and that's what this Colonia Dignidad was, experimenting on pressures of torture and how much people can take, and experiment on interrogation and the use of drugs if people wanted to flee that particular place, Colonia Dignidad, or if they wanted to flee out of Chile, they were given drugs, and this was identical to Jonestown. Well, the borders of Jonestown and Guyana are to Venezuela what the borders of the Chilean orphanage, religious camp for orphanage, was to Argentina, and I believe they were run for the same purpose. as I say, weapons for Chile and the military dictatorship come from South Africa, Great Britain, Israel, and West Germany. Fritz Bollmuller, a German-Chilean contact, has close ties with Chile and Germany, has pointed out the transfer of weapons from Chile to Chile from Bonn Embassy in Germany. Now, the West German ties to Chile have to do with uranium. The West German ties to South Africa both have to do with uranium. And this is important in an atomic age, too, where they both are building up the capability for atomic bombs. All the fuss last week about the ambassador's plane flying over South Africa and photographing had to do with atomic bombs and facilities there in South Africa. Not to get too far afield, you know, several tapes ago I talked about South African money going to Miss Thatcher and the elections in England. The Evening News 2 days ago said that part of the campaign of the extreme rightists in England will be to deport 3.2 million blacks that are living in England if the right wing that has many, many candidates running for election in May wins. One of the goals is to deport the blacks out of England and build up the British Empire again. That's the stated goal. And the money for that has been coming from this $87 million fund in South Africa that is still undisclosed, but some of it went to Miss Thatcher and the far-right party. On side 2 now we'll do more about Colonia Dignidad. This is Mae Brussell, tape number 385, April 20th, 1979, and it's side 2 of the tape. Now, to go back more to Colonia Dignidad. Aftermath, a book by Ladislas Farago. I've used references from that book before on the escape of Martin Bormann from Nazi Germany by way of the Vatican. His passport written with the help of the Grand Mufti. You have those tapes. In the book, Aftermath, on page 466, it describes how Martin Bormann, when he finally gets over to South America, lived in Chile a great deal of the time. And this page says that Martin Bormann, the Nazi war criminal, moved to Chile and stayed at Colonia Dignidad. This was the property, the ranch or farm, that housed Nazis after World War II. Colonia Dignidad was a center of Das Reich, an organization of Nazis in Chile, made up of the Nazis, many of the Nazis from World War II. Das Reich made it possible as an organization for a man named Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F, to live in Chile. He was a German citizen who invented the death trucks for concentration camps, known to have killed at least 100,000 Jews, and he was allowed to remain in Chile, and he was one of the people that associated down there with Martin Bormann. For those of you who don't know who Martin Bormann is, I'm always surprised at some who don't, but if this is the first tape you get with his name on it, he's the man who directed the Jewish extermination program in Germany and was given passports by the Vatican to leave after the war. He wasn't tried as a war criminal. And in the 60s, he lived at Colonia Dignidad. This was that private agricultural center that was to become a youth cult front, later for torture and experimentation, but the front was the orphanage. Now, when he was in Colonia Dignidad in the 1960s, in the early 60s, that's the time that Jim Jones was in Brazil with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Dr. Mengele, the famous surgical experimenter on various persons, went down to South America to continue his experiments. I understand he's still doing them on the Indians down in Paraguay, that he is continuing his Nazi experimentations there. But Jim Jones went from Indiana down to Brazil and was with the Central Intelligence Agency making trips out of Brazil, traveling around while he was stationed in Brazil in 62 to 63. And when he returned on his way home, he stopped at Matthews Ridge, which was later, or even then, a CIA center. And he stopped there in 63, and then later Matthews Ridge was just 30 miles from the property that Jones rented. But he saw the land in 63 and returned with $100,000 to begin his own camp, and he took that $100,000 that he brought home and began his own care center up in Mendocino in Redwood Valley in California. So that the same years that Martin Bormann was at Colonial Dignidad, Jim Jones was in Brazil. And the parallels between Jonestown and Colonial Dignidad are just in this one article, short article, so many. And the common denominator here of the CIA and Kissinger, Brzezinski, and the government interfering with these land agricultural centers is overwhelmingly sinister. And the reason it was so interesting for me to read the article, and then just as a footnote, the author brings in the question of Colonial Dignidad and aftermath and Martin Bormann living there. He only brought that in as a footnote and not beginning the article with it. Astounded me, because as those of you who have the past tapes, and if you don't have them, you can get tape number 379, March the 9th, I did a review of a book called Treason for My Daily Bread by Michael Lebedev. And the allegations in this book were that Martin Bormann, Hitler's top director, escaped to Paraguay after World War II. Now, in this book, it tells how he hired a man who was to work with the assassin and escort him from New Orleans to Dealey Plaza, where the man would do the fatal headshot that blew off John Kennedy's brains over behind the fence. And the allegations of the book that this trained assassin, who went by the code name Zed, was hired by Martin Bormann. Now, that would make sense if Martin Bormann was directing trained assassins or programming assassins to erase their memory, because I also made a tape in August of 77 that there was a place in Guyana called Jonestown where Jim Jones could be running this school for assassins and experimenting on their brains to erase their memory, that it could be a continuation of the Nazi school in Mexico, in Oaxaca, Mexico. The cover of that place was broken in 1970 when the Torbett document came out. And the point being that if Bormann is at a place called Colonial Dignidad, which becomes an experimental agricultural farm with an orphanage Christian cover, but is a place for interrogation and torture and body experimentation, it's very interesting that this same Bormann operation that is going on in Chile has so many parallels of persons and relationships to the Jonestown Nazi operation that has been compared to a fascist Nazi concentration camp. The question being, how many of these agricultural centers under religious church fronts are doing experimentation? See, I believe that that body count in Jonestown of 403 was accurate the first time around, but as long as they were closing in, they brought in a few, possibly from Venezuela, where the boats and doctors and nurses went and dumped them. They decayed at a different rate. The children's bodies weren't as decayed as the grown-ups, and therefore should have been identified and weren't. And the difference between the 403 and the 913 figure was an interesting difference that never has been explained. So that Treason for My Daily Bread, that book, is available now. Incidentally, Research in Aptos has the book. Tom Davis got books from England, and you can order them from him. Originally, we just had 2 copies, but they are available if you want to buy the book, Treason for My Daily Bread. And I'll give you the address, and you can order them. They are available now. But the same Martin Bormann that was living on Colonial Dignidad, that is charged with hiring the assassins that killed John Kennedy, is a connecting link to Nazi experimentation in Chile at the present time using that same property, and also the Jonestown area was a place which, after the death, was revealed as a school for assassins, and suggested that trained assassins under mind control are now out at large, out in the world. And I think that these parallels can't be ignored and should be going into much, much further. Now, the physical barriers were perfect for the Jonestown setup, and the physical barriers for the Colonia Dignidad were perfect. They were totally isolated. In one case, the Germans only spoke the German language, and they didn't learn Spanish, and they didn't learn any of the history. They wore the clothing of the 1940s, and they kept it a purely physical German environment, which reminds me that when the shipping fleets were built up of Aristotle Onassis and Hjalmar Schacht, the head of the Reichsbank who funded Adolf Hitler, got into funding the Japanese and German fleets of Aristotle Onassis. It turned out that all of Onassis's fleets only had German crews. They only spoke the German language, not the Greek language, but the German language, and they were all German crews, and they went down to Argentina and Antarctica and South America, back and forth. That's where the Onassis fortune was built up. They had German crews, and the children and the people on the ground of Colonial Dignidad only spoke German and were only allowed to speak German. The first reports of Colonial Dignidad being a secret torture detention center came out in February 4th, 1976, before the United Nations, the Economic and Social Council, and they told of its location near a town called Parallel, P-A-R-R-A-L-L, in the Andean Mountains, and a Colonel Espinosa, the chief of CENDEP, that's the Information Center for Political Prisoners, stopped in Parallel and made visits there, and there were 119 prisoners who disappeared, and many have been recognized as being in Colonial Dignidad. The DINA, that's the Direction de Investigation Nacional, that's the secret police of the Chilean government that was put in by the Central Intelligence Agency, holds prisoners there and has used detainees in there for the secret detention system. A second report came out about Colonial Dignidad in 1976, October the 8th, 1976, and I can see why the UN report of this was suppressed, because Jonestown was started in 73 and it was a continuation or a sister substation, and as I say, goodness knows how many there are, but Jonestown got started in 73 where they could train assassins and experiment on people and their minds and body, and if there were just 119 that disappeared, or admittedly from Dina and the Colonia Dignidad in Chile, we have a death record of 913 down in Jonestown, including UNIS Representative Leo Ryan. Now, this October 8th report described this as a Dina center. It was known as Colonial Dignidad. There's a torture center there. This was the report to the United Nations, that it was a specially equipped place underground, small, completely soundproof, hermetically sealed cells for prisoners. They took leather hoods over their heads. This was in the UN report. They stuck their faces, the hoods were stuck with chemicals, and as I said before, they were torture cells where they did interrogation. There were closed-circuit radio systems. People were kept naked and tied to the beds, and electric shocks were applied. This was for men and women. There was another exposure in March 1977, a third exposure of Colonial Dignidad that exposed Dina and the torture center, and this went to West Germany, and it was done by Amnesty International. This was the third exposure, and it was written up in Frankfurt, Germany, and it came from Chile. It was a 60-page booklet saying that the isolation, which is one of the comparisons to Jonestown, and the economic independence, another comparison to Jonestown, physically isolated and then not dependent on the economy, where people left town to go to work where you could see them go back and forth. You couldn't see these zombies at Jonestown, and they didn't interrelate with anyone around them. This article is, the 60-page article to Amnesty International said that the social separation, the isolation of this community, and its economic independence made it a good place for a torture camp, that it was a component of the secret detention system, And when the coup took place in 1973, that's when the United States government overthrew the Chilean government and put the Nazis into power. Since that time, over 2,000 Chileans had disappeared. That's from 1973 to 1976. And 1973 is when the property was rented in Jonestown in Guyana for Jim Jones, and that was the year of his arrest in Los Angeles, and that was the time when the Attorney General, Evel Younger, and the U.S. attorneys and the city attorney in Los Angeles suppressed the arrest records because he was meant to go down to Jonestown, and some simple lewd arrest thing was not going to interfere with the operation. The same year that the coup took place, that the military junta could use the detention center where Martin Bormann had lived with top Nazis, that was the year that the Jonestown was set up in 73. The report that came out from Amnesty International in 76 showed how the clandestine operation worked, the apparatus worked, and the courts in Germany suppressed the Amnesty International reports. The people from the COLONIA DIGNIDAD went to court in West Germany and used the courts to suppress it. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle suppressed stories of Jonestown. The San Francisco Examiner suppressed them. The National Enquirer was suppressing articles. Mark Lane was given $10,000 to praise Jonestown. Charles Gary was praising it. They used Associated Press, United Press to praise it. They used KGO radio station, and Lane was given $10,000 to praise the agricultural farm at a time when medical experimentations and brainwashing were going on down in Jonestown. It wasn't the agricultural farm they said it was. That's another parallel, that the United States press, like the German press, were in collusion to suppress, taking away individual rights. And certainly, if there's all these unidentified children, there's many unidentified there, and as I say, 199 children unidentified. How did they get there? Whose children were they? And why were the federal courts not protecting at least the children? This wasn't an adult decision here, and it wasn't an adult decision to take these people, they were orphans, and take them down to Chile as a front for a torture department. Funding for this operation in Chile and this Colonial Dignidad came from West Germany, and much of the funding for Jonestown, another parallel, came from West Germany. Mrs. Layton came from Germany, the woman whose husband was in charge of the chemical biological warfare proving grounds at Utah, who's been in the military intelligence chemical warfare division of his adult career and is in agricultural branch of it now, which is the agricultural front for these extermination camps. It's his son that is in jail down in Georgetown for charges of the death at the airport when Leo Ryan was killed. But Mrs. Layton had given, admittedly, several $100,000 to Jim Jones, but she had a father, still has a father in Germany that was sending money, and also there was another fund coming from Germany to Jonestown. So Germany was funding this organization down in Chile, and Germany was funding a share of Jonestown, and this part has never yet come to the front. Amnesty International's report in 1976 gave at least 4 examples that they had where people lived and survived and left the detention center. One was in January 30th, 1975, where 30 minors were held there. May 75, where German people arrested citizens near a town called Talca and detained them in Colonial Dignidad. These were German-speaking people, not Chilean police, Spanish people, but German-speaking. A third group was held several weeks in Colonia, and in May 76, 38 were arrested and taken to Colonia. Amnesty International had specific cases, and then they had 3 who were tortured who got away finally and out of the country, who were at this orphanage. It's an agricultural center, an orphanage, which has underground tortures, which house the Nazis, that belongs to the Nazi government in Chile. They took the testimony of 3 who got away, and in the courts, when Amnesty International was sued by these people to suppress this information, and you remember how Charles Gary, the attorney, was representing People's Temple to stop lawsuits, stop getting the information out to the public, and Mark Lane was going to take on the protection of the People's Temple because they were being suppressed by the federal government, his usual shtick. People got out of Jonestown and told the State Department, told the congressman what was going on. People got out of Chile and testified about their direct experience, but the courts in West Germany and the news media suppressed the details and wouldn't let the story be told about these people who were tortured. One was an Adriana Borquez, Borquez. She was arrested in 1975. 10 police took her away. Her eyes were taped. Her hands were tied. She was hooded. She was taken in an ambulance with other prisoners. That's another thing. They have their own hospital at this agricultural center, like Jonestown had its own hospital, and they had their own ambulance system. And the Guyanese police said that they had airplanes that took the sick out of the country and didn't tell where they ever went. They were flown out of Jonestown. They had their own private river there and their own airport. Both of these compounds had. This woman was taken by an ambulance with other prisoners and then was led down this ramp, which was this underground detention center that was part of the agricultural orphanage home, and put on a cement floor. And first they give them verbal interrogations, and then they tie them to the bed frames, and of course electric shocks on all of her body, breast, vagina, tortured, screaming. She said that silence came from the underground buildings and wet towels put over their mouths, and you lose control of your bowels and they fall on the floor. And she was kicked on and stomped and insulted, and they asked her about the solidarity of local citizens, I guess, trying to organize against the Nazi government that's been put in by the CIA. And then she was forced to witness another woman being tortured, and she recognized the woman and asked her to tell the bishop if she got out, whoever got out first, what was going on. And they tried to tell her, you're a communist. The bishop is a communist. The cardinal is a communist. Anybody who opposes the Chilean government that was put in by Henry Kissinger and Nazis from South Africa and West Germany is accused of being a communist. Another person, Eric Zott, got to Austria. He's one of the few that escaped from this detention. He was arrested separately, January 1975. Incidentally, 2 people were arrested on the same date that have affidavits with Amnesty International, and the date was April 23rd, 1975. So this is some kind of an anniversary, being April the 20th. It's an anniversary of their arrest, and of course it's the week of Hitler's birthday. Maybe that's why they were rounding these people up. And Eric Zott is now in Austria. He was a friend of Louis Peebles. They were acquainted, but they were arrested separately. They were held at detention centers and then taken to Colonial Dignidad, where they were tortured, and their stories separately were almost identical in the way they were taken away, and the way they were tortured, and the way they were chained, and the helmets on their head, and the electric shock. And Zott and Peebles described a wooden box they were put in, just the size of your body. Jim Jones had a wooden box under the ground where they kept people from 1 day up to a week. And in this box they pounded it with sticks until the sound magnified. And they used these underground boxes, and they used the same kind of torture boxes in Colonial Dignidad. And they went on to say that they believed that Mr. Zott and Louis Peebles said that they believed that the purpose of the torture at Colonial Dignidad was to experiment and to see how much sophisticated torture you can use to make it a work of art that came from the Nazi concentration camps. It wasn't just to get information, but experiments on tortures. And they were the ones who talked about dogs trained to commit sexual aggressions and dogs used to destroy the sexual organs of both sexes. And they tested there the limits of resistance to methods of torture, to beatings, electricity, hanging, ways to drive detainees insane through drugs. Another comparison to Jonestown, because when people wanted to leave, as I said before, the Chilean agricultural paradise, the commune for the little children, they were kept with drug lobotomies. They came out as if they had a lobotomy, and some were beaten. In the same way here, the people were experimented with drugs to see if they could get them insane, and they had prolonged isolation in subhuman conditions. The orphans and others on the agricultural compound in Chile couldn't hear anything. They were isolated. And the orphanage, the Christian orphanage, is simply a front, an agricultural commune that is used for other purposes that the West German government will not expose, just as Jonestown was used for other purposes, which the United States federal government will not expose. You see, the cavalier way, or the way they pass off, the FBI says, we won't investigate the death of John Paisley, a United States citizen, an agent of the FBI, an agent of the CIA, an agent of the Defense Intelligence Agency, most of his adult life since 1947. His body has a bullet in the head and is sunk with weight in a bay when he goes sailing. And the government says, well, we don't know if it was communist, and we don't know if he was a traitor, or if the KGB killed him, or if he went to the KGB, or if it was Paisley, or if it was a murder or a suicide. The FBI just said, we're not going to probe anymore. We cut the death probe. It's that casual, and that's the casual way that Jonestown is going to be done. It's the casual way that John Kennedy assassination was done, the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King, and now we get to the heavy part of the genocide or the deportation or the extermination. And the real bottom line of this is, how long are people going to sit back and let the press and the United Nations cover up those specific Nazis who are named, whose locations are named, who are funded by the federal government? All you have to do is open up the book, Reinhard Gehlen, Spy of the Century. You don't open the book. On the back cover, Chief of Hitler's Intelligence for the Eastern Division, given 200 million United States tax dollars by Allen Dulles. Now the harvest is coming in, and we have to accept responsibility for seeing that book. I think came out in 71, and it's been common knowledge, at least by the book reviewers and the book clubs, that the Nazis have been funded, at least in 71, if you didn't want to find out earlier. But the torturing has been going on, and these gentlemen refer to it as personalized torture, that they bring them in and talk softly and deliberately, and they have a data or a computer on the people, and they know their personality and their traits, and they talk to them very quietly. It begins very slowly, and then it gets debilitating and exhausting, and then they can get them to say anything they want. The effect, the total effect described by Adriana Borges of the torture, which is a programmed event with long sessions, and then the box and the noises, the isolation, the electrodes, and also there were electrodes at Jonestown, another comparison, and drugs. She said the effect is desperation, of complete repression, of the loss of personal dignity, of emotions, of thoughts and ideas, of ideology, of religion, of habits, of moral and social concepts. Now, that was the end effect of Jim Jones on everyone who stayed. The people that left, a few blacks, but mostly the white entourage of the Central Intelligence Agency, which I'm convinced set up Jonestown, had the same effect on those people and tested either mass suicide. It worked. They were willing to kill their children and die. Even somebody like Mrs. Amos held up her children's hair, so the man could cut the throats, and then she died. That Mrs. Harris that came from Palo Alto, I met her husband. I told you before, Mrs. Bouquet, whose son died at Jonestown, who at the time when she wanted to see him, she was in Georgetown and wanted to go, and he wouldn't see her. He said, the only way I'll see her is through the scope of a rifle. Those people are not angry at the federal government for losing a daughter, for losing a son or an ex-wife. I never met such hostility. It was in the office of Leo Ryan in Palo Alto. Ryan had died. Holsinger was in the office. His son, rather, was in the office. They treated me, these people, as if I were an enemy exposing them. And what they are, this entourage, are a group of people identical to the people that set up this group, Colonial Dignidad, in Germany. They're a group of people that, if the place were broken open, such as the Jonestown thing came down, would all split, and they would resent your talking to them. The people that ran Colonial Dignidad or set it up, the people who cooked it, who milked the cows, who farmed, who wash the clothes for the children at the orphanage, who teach the school there, would split. They would never tell you about Martin Bormann or the war criminals or the torture. They would split. And anybody who investigated Colonial Dignidad would be an enemy. And that's the way it is in Jonestown. The people that live in Berkeley, the people from Stanford, Tim Stone, Mr. Harris, Mrs. Bouquet, the whole entourage, you are an enemy if you talk about what went on in Jonestown. They're not angry. They're part of the federal system. And this Adriana Bouquet described the desperation, the loss of your moral and social concepts. Everything that makes a human being was trampled on by bestiality. She went on to say, for Amnesty International, fascism doesn't respect the personality of each of us. It is a hellish steamroller. This is the voice of a woman who was tortured there, one of the few who got out alive, but when she got out alive, her information was suppressed by the press in Germany, the press in the United States, and only in this article of Counterspy that came out has this information been available for the public, and that's why I'm putting it on these tapes. The Federal Republic of Germany in the United Nations abstained from voting on this human rights problem when it was brought before them. The spokesperson for the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that false information was given out. The United Nations, the federal government in Germany, have protected what they called an agricultural farm, and it's an orphanage and agricultural farm, and have not addressed themselves to what Colonial Dignidad is. Eric Straitling, the ambassador of West Germany to Chile, who was the ambassador of West Germany to South Africa, said, in quotes, Colonia Dignidad is a well-organized, efficient organization. And Adolfo Yankelwick, I don't pronounce it right, but I'll give you the spelling, former press attaché to the Chilean mission to the United Nations, says Colonial was a nice place. People there do a good job. He was interviewed in the summer of '77, and this is similar to Mark Lane, Charles Geary, KGO Radio, the Chronicle, Ignoring the Question, the San Francisco Examiner, and Michael Prokes, the press agent who recently did a De Mohrenschildt suicide job that we have to get back to later. Colonia was a nice place. Jonestown was a nice place. They did a good job. They did a good job. It was well organized and efficient, and the spokesman here said it's well organized and efficient, and the connections to the fascism are still suppressed. Next week, on tape number 386, we will run down, if I can put in it 1 hour, 67 parallels of Jonestown to Colonial Dignidad, one in Guyana put in by the head of government, Mr. Burnham, put in by the Central Intelligence Agency, the other down in Chile, the Chilean government and Mr. Pinochet and the DINA, put in by the Central Intelligence Agency. Next week we'll do a parallel, 67 parallels, in a 7-page article of Jonestown to Colonial Dignidad. And in the meantime, if you can, have a good week.